Hey guys, we're looking at New Answers lesson number 22. And the question they pose is natural selection the same thing as evolution? Okay? So if you look at the very beginning of the book, it says natural selection is an observable process that is often purported to be the underlying mechanism of unobservable molecules to man evolution. The concepts are indeed different, though some mistakenly interchange the two. So one of the first things what you have to do when you're looking at this is to define terms, okay? Because if you're unclear of the terms as a Christian and you're trying to debate with someone who's an evolutionist, you're going to struggle if you're not operating with the exact same terms. They may be thinking one thing, you're thinking another, and then you're going to run into problems. So let's look at some of the definitions evolutionists give to natural selection. I have three of them here for you. It says evolutionary change based on the differential reproductive success of individuals within a species. Evolutionary changes, okay? The second one says the process by which genetic traits are passed on to each successive generation. Over time, natural selection helps species become better adapted to their environment, also known as, quote, the survival of the fittest. Natural selection is the driving force behind the process of evolution. Lastly, their definition says the process in nature by which, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, only the organisms best adapted to their environment tend to survive and transmit their genetic characters in increasing numbers to succeeding generations, while the less adapted tend to be eliminated. The creationists have a different definition, and you'll see there's no mention of evolution in this definition, where the evolutionists all claim that it's part of the evolutionary process, okay? So the creationist definition of natural selection is this: a process whereby organisms possessing specific characteristics survive better than others in a given environment, or under a given environment, or under a given selective pressure, okay? The problem for evolutionists is that natural selection is non-directional, but evolution of the molecule to man variety requires directional change. And what they mean by that is this. In order to go from molecule to man evolution, something has to basically keep going in the same direction in the same time and continually making changes to get it to that molecule to man. But natural selection is non-directional. It seems almost random depending on the location and the place that you are. So then let's define evolution. Three definitions for this as well. It says unfolding in time of a predictable or prepackaged sequence in an inherently progressive or at least directional manner. Next definition says the theory that all life forms are descended from one or several common ancestors that were present on early Earth 3.3 to 4 billion years ago. The last definition is the big idea, or evolution, is that living things, species, are related to one another through common ancestry from earlier forms that differed from them. Darwin called this, quote, descent with modification. And it is still the best definition of evolution we can use, especially with members of the general public or with young learners. Makes you question, why is that the case? Here's the thing. All of these definitions give the same basic idea that evolution is directional in producing all the life forms on Earth today from one or several ancestral life forms billions of years ago. But again, that can't be the case because natural selection is not directional. Your book goes on to talk a lot about some biology terms, or you get they use the definition of a dog with long hair and short hair, and so you could have dogs with long hair, dogs with short hair, dogs with medium hair, and depending on the environment and the situation where they live, certain animals may be weeded out, because if you're a long-haired animal living in a desert, you're not going to survive well, and vice versa. If you're a short-haired animal living in very cold climates, you're going to kind of weed those out until eventually you're only being able to produce, long-haired in certain areas or short-haired in certain areas. And again, that is non-directional changes, and it does not equate to man to molecule. It just simply shows that there are natural selection based on several different things. And read the book, it gives it a little more clearly, because this is just kind of an overview for you. But let's look at the historical background of natural selection, okay? When most people see or think natural selection, they think Charles Darwin. He wrote the book on the origin of species, and most people give him credit for that term, natural selection. However, there's a man named Edmund Blythe who wrote in the magazine of Natural History all kinds of things talking about natural selection. And it was 22 years before Darwin's book, and a lot of what Darwin says in his book comes directly from that magazine article. Okay, so it's not necessarily new, and Darwin has twisted it because Blythe believed more in God, and Darwin obviously does not. So ultimately it comes down to the question, is natural selection biblical? Okay, and so on page 275 of your book, I want to look at a few different things, okay? It says, it is important to see natural selection as a mechanism that God used to allow organisms to deal with their changing environments in a sin-cursed world, especially after the flood. It goes on to say that natural selection, acting on genetic information, is the primary mechanism that explains how organisms could have survived after the fall and the flood, when the world changed drastically from God's original design or creation. Lastly, it says natural selection, though fueled by death, helps the population by getting rid of genetic defects, etc. Okay? So what we need to remember is that there is a form of natural selection, and it is biblical, but it is not the equivalent of evolution. There's a chart on page 276 of your book, and I do want you to look at this, and so make sure you take the time to look at it. And it talks about the things that natural selection can do and the things that natural selection cannot do, okay? The biggest for me is natural selection can decrease genetic information, but it cannot increase or provide new genetic information, okay? So there's no way for it to create new species or new things. So that goes to speciation, right? It is possible outcome of natural selections. For example, when we talked about the dogs, you can have it where it is now only long-haired dogs or only short-haired dogs because of natural selection. But again, it can't create new species. There's not something that went from dog to something else. On page 281 of your book, it says that speciation has never been observed to form an organism of a different kind, such as a dog species producing a cat. Speciation leads to a loss of information and not the gain of information that would be required for evolution. So as I wrap up here, I just want you to, like I said, make sure you're reading this material, make sure you're understanding that natural selection does occur, but it is not what evolution is trying to claim it to be, okay? And so that's why it is very important when discussing natural selection as a possible mechanism for evolution that we define the terms. Make sure we're talking about the same things, or else both people can get confused, okay? Lastly, I want to say this. The creationist view of natural selection is supported biblically and scientifically. Natural selection is a God-ordained process that allows organisms to survive in a post-fall, post-flood world. It is an observable reality that occurs in the present and takes advantage of the variations within kinds and works to preserve the genetic viability of the kinds. Simply put, the changes that are observed today show variation within the created kind, a horizontal change. For a molecules to man evolutionary model, there must be a change from one kind into another, a vertical change. This is simply not observed. Thanks.